Well, hi, my name is Richard Bickers, and I'm the creator of Squash Levels, the level-based system that hopefully you're familiar with. It wasn't that long ago, I had a chat with Mr. Bevan Duff from Squash Pod, and we talked about Squash Levels and some of its history and where it's come from. And as a result of that, there were a few questions which we thought we'd see if we could tackle sort of one at a time, really, do a mini podcast per. So I thought I'd start with an introduction to what levels are. That seemed to be the most common question that's come through, and it's a good question. It's not necessarily easy to answer in just a few seconds, really, or a few minutes even, because it's taken years to develop the system and a great deal of research, really. But we'll give it a go. So in a nutshell, what you get with squash levels is you get a number. That's your level, and it represents how well you're playing. It gives you a chance to answer that fateful question that we used to get asked in the old days before we could answer it, was how good are you? If you come across a guy that you've not played before, and they say, well, how good are you? Well, we could never really answer that question. You could talk about people you'd played or people you'd beaten or teams you'd played in, but it was all a little bit vague. So much better really to have a number and say, well, I'm 1,200. That's my level, and everyone just instantly knows, how well you're playing, or almost how good you are. So that's really what the purpose of First Squash Levels is for. It assigns this level for you after every match, right through your entire history. So it's a really good indicator of how well you're playing at any particular point in your playing career. Now, the next question is, what does the number actually mean? So if I'm at level 1,200, does that actually mean anything? And the idea really is that, well, yes, it does. These numbers are mathematically comparative. So if I'm twice as good as my opponent and I'm 1,200, well, that probably means he's around 600. And that works at every level. So right the way down from the very beginners right up to the top pros. If you are twice as good as someone else, then that implies you're going to get twice as many points. So I guess a simple example is if you play 3 rallies, then you're likely to win 2 and they'll win 1. And if you're playing right the way through to the end of a game, then you're probably going to get around 11 points, whereas they're going to get 5 or 6. Now, having a mathematically accurate level, one that you can compare with other players, gives you quite a few advantages. So you can, for instance, look at your charts, your level chart, and look at your history and see your profile. I hope you're watching yourself improve. That's all sort of mathematically accurate. You can look at yourself and say, well, actually, I'm twice as good as I was 2 years ago. It's probably most useful for comparing yourself with other players, like someone you're about to play in a tournament. If you don't know who they are, you can look them up and see what level they've got. You can compare yourself with your teammates, or in fact anyone on the whole system. It's really interesting to just see how good the top players are as well. They're up in the sort of stratospheric 50, 60, 70,000. And for me, the thing that's really interesting is just how close they all are, which probably explains why we get the odd upset. Well, hopefully that explains a little bit about the numbers themselves and what we use them for. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes looking at where we get them from. How do we actually work these numbers out? That's probably the big question, really, that everyone's asking. So I'll give a bit of an overview here, and then we'll look to perhaps dive into a bit more detail in some future podcasts. The algorithm itself is split really into 4 main parts. The first, as we talked about, is the mass. That's a fairly obvious bit. It's relatively straightforward, really. Is the 2 to 1 we talked about. It's based on results. So if I was to win a game 9-5 or 11-5 or 11-6, then that clearly makes me twice as good, at least point scores wise. In the older days when I used to play English scoring, it wasn't quite so easy. What does 9-5 actually mean? It's not twice as good, so we had to do the maths on that. We do now do that, and there are people who still play in the hand in, hand out, so we can work with those point scores. So what you do is you look at the results from 2 players, and you look at their levels before the match, so you can work out what the expected result should have been. You can look at the actual result and compare it with the expected result, and so you end up with a ratio. And that ratio will tell you whether the match was played as expected, or whether perhaps one of the players played, well, it appears they played 10 or 20% better. So you don't know whether one player played better or the other played worse, or both. So what we have to do is to share it. So imagine there's I don't know, that's actually a 20% difference, which sounds quite a lot, but people vary a lot from match to match. And so the first thing you do is you split the difference. So what you do is that one of the players plays is increased by 10%, and the other players drop by 10%. But that's all before the damping. So the next thing we do is we apply the damping, and that depends on the match played. So, for instance, a box match is damped more; it's effectively weighted less than a league match. A league match is weighted less than a tournament, and so on. So every type of match has got a particular weighting or the amount it's damped, and that's all factored in. So by the time you've adjusted that what the player is going to be moving by, it's usually only a few percent, unless it's a complete upset. Now, what we apply beyond then is behavioural damping, behavioural modelling, and there's a lot of complexity behind that. The reality is that people don't put the same effort in for every match. A couple of good examples would be if you're playing someone who's not so good, then you probably will just give them a bit of a run around, and obviously that doesn't look right in terms of results. So you're behaving slightly differently to the classic. Other cases are, for instance, if you're a league player, you probably won't treat boxes quite so importantly. Or if you're playing tournament, you're much more likely to be putting the effort into a tournament because, well, you could get knocked out in one round. Even Monrads, people typically play different tournaments, so you have to factor all these things in. But there's actually a lot of different behavioural cases which are all factored in now, and that'll have to be the topic of another podcast. But the effect of behavioural modelling is that you will allow for some players to be not putting quite so much effort in. So the result of that is that one player may not go up or down as much as their opponent has gone down or up. And that has actually a very significant effect on the system, because you effectively lose level in the system, and the whole thing drifts up or down. That can be within the individual players, or it could be a pool such as a league or club or whatever. So basically this drift is something that we have to factor in and work out within the system. That's part of the calibration, which I'll talk about another time. I'll just briefly mention the calibration because it's an important part of the algorithm. So I mentioned the maths, I mentioned the weighting, I mentioned the behavioural modelling, and the last piece is the calibration. And that's really important. That's the part of the algorithm that makes sure that players in, say, Kent are equivalent to the same players in Surrey or France, frankly, anywhere in the world. And indeed, this is where it gets a bit clever, is at any time. So you can go back, look 5 years, even 10 years ago, and the levels really should be equivalent, and that's down to the time-based calibration that we do. But that's kind of the algorithm in a nutshell, and I'll probably touch on some of the details in other podcasts, but I shall leave it here. Anyway, hopefully that gave you something of an overview and a little teaser, so that you're listening next time for a little bit more detail.